We've talked all morning. They had, of course, a kind of a fairy tale wedding 2 years ago when they snuck away to an island off the coast of Georgia, and that now famous photograph, which we've seen. Just recapping one more time, John F. Kennedy Jr. missing in a small plane. It is believed his wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, is with him, and perhaps her sister and the flight instructor. And I'm looking at my watch because we are now 3 full hours into the Coast Guard search, which was launched at 7:55 Eastern Time. You are watching CBS News special coverage of this breaking news. We're going to continue this special coverage with Dan Rather at CBS News headquarters. Dan?
Thank you, Dawn and Anthony. Dan Rather at CBS News World headquarters in New York. While the world waits word on what has happened to John F. Kennedy Jr. and his missing small single-engined aircraft. For those of you just joining us and for others who may have heard smatterings of information as the morning went along, this is CBS News continuing coverage of the breaking story, the search for an airplane carrying John F. Kennedy Jr., and there's no other way to put it, the fear, the deepening fear that perhaps the so-called Kennedy curse has struck again. But we do not know that that has happened. We're going to bring you up to date quickly. Small aircraft, a Piper Saratoga single engine carrying the son of the former President of the United States, was reported missing early this morning. They took off from a New Jersey airport about 8:45 last night. There's an unconfirmed report, although we have some reason to believe that it's true, that the plane was last believed seen on radar somewhere west of Martha's Vineyard. The plane is believed to have carried not only John F. Kennedy Jr., but his wife Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and her sister Lauren. They'd taken off from New Jersey, heading to Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts for a Kennedy family wedding. The plane never arrived. At this hour, the Coast Guard and the Air Force are searching the waters from eastern Long Island to Martha's Vineyard along the path the plane is presumed to have taken. Important to note that while the weather overall was clear, there was considerable haze in the area, and haze can be dangerous for an aircraft of this size and in those conditions. We go now to Bob Orr in Washington, our CBS News aviation expert. Bob?
Dan, this is, as the hours go on, very, very troubling indeed to the federal investigators and obviously to the search and rescue people. What is of great concern is the time delay involved here. Because the Kennedy plane last night took off from New Jersey on a visual flight and without a flight plan, the FAA really has no official word of when it was supposed to arrive anywhere. So by FAA standards, it's still not late. What happened sometime after midnight, I'm told, is that a member of the Kennedy family contacted the federal authorities to say the plane was hours overdue. The FAA then went back, tried to verify as much of the information as it could, and by the time then the Coast Guard was contacted and the first helicopter could get in the air, that was about 8 a.m. this morning. So if you look at the timetable, that's a problem. If the plane took off, as we believe it did, between 8:30 and 8:45, and if the search didn't start until 8 a.m. this morning, it's possible that airplane could have been missing for as long as 10 hours, maybe even more than that. And when you're talking about a very small airplane and 4 people, possibly over water, the North Atlantic, that raises some real problems.
Bob, from what you know of this aircraft, small Piper Saratoga, if the aircraft went down in water, what are the chances the passengers would get out? To the uninitiated, including myself, you'd say, well, they'd have a chance getting out of that plane.
Well, they'd have a chance. And I mean, Dan, I think we have to be careful, as we have been all morning, to say clearly that we don't know what happened to the airplane and we don't know that it's in water, but it is a possibility. Much of that flight path from Caldwell, New Jersey to the Vineyard would be over the North Atlantic and Long Island Sound, perhaps. And people have the mistaken idea, Dan, that gee, water must be somehow softer than land, so if we have to go down, if we have to make an emergency ditching, gee, water might give us a better chance. It's a misconception. Actually, when you're coming down from aloft and perhaps with increasing velocity, water is about as hard, they say, as concrete. We've seen in some of the major accidents like TWA 800, the accident involving the 757 Bergen Air jet off the coast of the Dominican Republic, large airplanes with heavy structure be shattered to pieces the size of tabletops. So, number one, if the plane came down in water, there's a good chance that that plane would break up very badly. Could the people get out? Of course, that's a possibility. There's rescue gear on board. There's life jackets. And hopefully the plane had an emergency beacon. If that's the case, perhaps somebody can kind of hone in on that signal. But over water in the middle of the night, and then with an hours-long delay before the Coast Guard rescue could begin, I have to tell you, Dan, that doesn't add up to very good. It
doesn't add up to very good, but always coming back to the fact, and it is a fact, we don't know what has happened to this aircraft.
Right.
No one can say. If you'll hold on, Bob Orr, I want to go to Mark Nolan at the White House in a moment and then perhaps come back to you as our CBS News coverage of what's happened to the missing aircraft of John F. Kennedy Jr. continues. There's been a lot of talk about, well, wasn't a signal picked up at sea? Now, this is what we know about that. Government sources who choose not to be identified have said that an emergency beeper signal was received at about 2:15 this morning off the coast of Long Island. Now, rescue crews were sent to the scene off Mattatuck, Rhode Island, but no subsequent signal has been heard, and nobody quite knows what to make of that report. We go now to Mark Nolan, CBS News correspondent at the White House. Mark?
Dan, there's apprehension here at the White House. That goes without saying. The President and the First Lady are at Camp David, where they're spending the weekend. They got a phone call this morning around 7 from White House Chief of Staff John Podesta, informing them that the FAA had received reports that John F. Kennedy Jr.'s aircraft was missing, that his wife Carolyn was on board, along with a couple of others. The President has asked to be kept informed. The President has been informed and has been made aware that the Department of Transportation, which includes the U.S. Coast Guard and the FAA, along with the Air Force, are involved in the search and rescue efforts. In a written statement issued this morning, the White House said, "All our prayers and thoughts are with the families of those on board the aircraft." The President continues to be briefed on the situation, and that's what we're told here at the White House. Dan?
Mark Nolan, let's go back to Bob Orr in our Washington studio. Bob, if you're still there, I want to come back for at least the moment to what some of the possibilities are. While emphasizing all the way through we don't have many facts, it's entirely possible that John F. Kennedy Jr. and all others aboard this small Piper single-engine, and by the way, not a jet, regular engine aircraft, that they could be alive. That is a working possibility. But obviously, the plane taking off last night about 8:45 from New Jersey, expected on Martha's Vineyard sometime before midnight. It's been missing a long time. And since no word has come of the aircraft or those on board at all, as each passing hour goes by, the chances grow that the news will not be good when we finally determine some news. If Bob Orr, if you're still there at the Washington studio, let's tick off what the possibilities are, and italicize all caps what the possibilities are. What comes to your mind in terms of possibilities that while the plane, something dire may have happened to it, that all are alive? What are the possibilities? One, they could have gone down and sea and all gotten out. What else?
That's right. Dan, there are a number of possibilities. I mean, one that can't be completely dismissed is that the plane, for some reason, decided to go somewhere else. Now, that seems absurd because no one from the family has been contacted. But when we talk about possibilities, and we emphasize capital P, possibilities, that plane could go somewhere else without the federal authorities knowing about it. That's because this plane did not file a flight plan. It was not required to. It's not routine that one would be filed. This is a small general aviation plane going from point to point. There is no requirement that the federal authorities be notified what the intention of travel is. So that's one possibility, although I think out of hand we would have to say that the family would likely know if that was the case. The other possibility that comes to mind, Dan, is if the plane developed a problem. Again, that's if. This is a single-engine plane. It does have glide capability. It has a good performance history. It's the Piper Saratoga. It's the largest of what's known as the Cherokee family. It accommodates 2 pilots. It accommodates up to 4 passengers. Let's say for a moment that it develops some kind of engine problem. The pilot could aim for a highway. He could aim for a field. Almost any dusty track would do. But keep in mind, you're now at least at late dusk along the eastern seaboard, probably more correctly at night. Trying to land in an unlighted area like a highway or a field is highly problematic. So I know that the search people will check all of the grass strips, all of the so-called uncontrolled airports, and there are a number of them, all the private landing facilities. The problem, Dan, is that by now no one has called to say there's a plane in my backyard. So that leaves us with with this awful and growing possibility that somewhere the plane has gone down over water. And if that's the case, there are really just a couple of outcomes. We can all hope and pray that somehow the people are all right and they'll be found. The other outcome, of course, is much worse to think about. Dan?
Bob, emphasizing again, we're talking about possibilities. If the aircraft went down, and you've made the point very well, landing on water, it may seem soft, but when you hit the water with an aircraft, particularly one of this small size, it's like hitting concrete. If it went down in sea, and if there was even a chance that the people could get out of the aircraft and into the water, let's talk for a moment, just to educate ourselves, how that would work. Small plane, we believe there were 6 people, we believe there were 6 people in the aircraft. John F. Kennedy Jr., the flight instructor, his wife, and her sister. So we believe at least, yes, 5 people, or at least were in the plane. Let's talk about how, is it reasonable to believe they could get out? And if they did get out, is there survival at sea equipment aboard the plane? Where is it on this plane?
It's possible, Dan, depending on what the experts call the angle of attack, and what that means is what the attitude of the plane was as it approached the water, that it could be a survivable crash landing. I mean, in the best circumstance, if there was a problem and if the pilot still had control of the airplane, even without an engine, theoretically he could kind of feather that plane in almost like a glider, get very low, and then take his chances ditching at sea. I don't know precisely what kind of emergency equipment is on board. I think it's a fair assumption that there were some life jackets on board. There are probably some emergency flares on board. We're told the plane was equipped with an emergency transponder beacon that would, at a last resort, rather, at least notify authorities where to look. The plane is made of light materials. Theoretically, some of those materials could float. I mean, we're talking strictly in the realm of possibility here, and we have to be clear that we say we don't know that any of this is the accurate scenario. Yes, it's possible under the best conditions that the plane could be ditched at sea and the people could be found. The other possibility, and it might help the air rescue people, is if there is a pilot out there that had a conversation, if there is an air traffic controller who heard this plane transverse his airspace and remembers a conversation, that would at least narrow the search area. What was the last point that the Kennedy plane was heard from? At this point, I've heard swirling reports that perhaps there was some contact made, the last contact, in an area west of Martha's Vineyard. I personally can't confirm that, but these are still open questions, and I think we certainly can't give up hope, but I think we have to be reasonable. As time goes on here, this appears to be bad.
Bob Orr, please understand that we're passing along information to you as we get it. It is deep in the professional id of CBS News to check, double check. Before we say something is a fact, we like to have 2 independent sources. So we'll be clear with you as we go along what's fact and what's the way of speculation about this son, the only son of the assassinated President of the United States, John F. Kennedy Jr., a remarkable young man in many ways. Certainly there are Americans who are not admirers of the Kennedy family, but even for those who are not particularly admirers of the Kennedy family, may not even like them, there was much to admire in this young man. Who could forget that as a child he gave that salute as the funeral procession of his father passed by in Washington, D.C. Then he went on to Brown University, then went on to law school, got himself past the bar. Yes, he had some difficulty, but he passed a very tough bar. Became an attorney in New York, worked as an assistant district attorney. I read somewhere this morning, somebody said, well, the law didn't much appeal to him. Based on my own conversations, limited as it was, that was not altogether the case. He was very proud of being a lawyer. He was proud of having toughed it out in law school and, yes, taken the bar a couple of times and finally passed the bar. He had a great love of the law. However, he found it was not what he wanted to spend full time doing. So after being a prosecutor and a successful one for a couple of years, he founded George Magazine, social and political magazine, and he ran it. He really ran it. He wasn't just the proverbial, quote, front for the magazine. He did a lot of interviews for the magazine, Fidel Castro and others that he interviewed. He's been married since 1996. President Clinton, we're told, again, has been told about Kennedy's disappearance and his monitoring developments from Camp David. The search is underway in the waters between Long Island and Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, and beyond that, there isn't a lot that can be said. So you may say, well, why are you staying in the air? Here's why. The Kennedy family has been, in the words of some, cursed for so long. The assassination well, go back before that, John F. Kennedy's brother, his older brother, who was to be he was the apple of his father's eye. The late Joe Kennedy Sr. was going to go into politics, was killed as a pilot in World War II. John F. Kennedy becomes president, is assassinated. His brother, Robert F. Kennedy, making a run for the presidency in 1968, is shot to death by a man in a hotel in Los Angeles. And then, and I was trying to look this up before, I think it's this coming Sunday, would be 30 years since a car driven by John F. Kennedy's uncle, Senator Robert Kennedy of Massachusetts, plunged off a bridge and into the waters of Chappaquiddick, killing a 28-year-old companion, Mary Jo Kopechne, and all that flowed out of that. There's just been one tragedy after another with the Kennedy family. You can say, well, every family has its tragedies. True enough. But this family, which is as close as America comes to having royalty, sort of a word that always sticks in our throat as we say it, because we're not a country with monarchy, but as close as we come to royalty, this family has had so much public tragedy. And as the hours go by now, with no word of what happened to this plane, the word curse keeps coming up in conversation and in one's head. We can hope for the best, but as Bob Orr has pointed out several times, as each hour goes by, it's harder and harder to imagine a scenario in which something, at least dangerous, if not tragic, has happened to this aircraft. Now we're going to go now to Kevin Smedley. Kevin Smedley is a private pilot, and he's going to talk to us about John F. Kennedy's plane and local flying conditions. Thank you for being with us, Kevin. I really appreciate you coming in, and we've been trying to get somebody. Set for us, you know roughly what the weather was, what the haze conditions were last night. You know this kind of airplane. Set the scene for us as John F. Kennedy took off from New Jersey Airport about 8:45 last night, and what it would have been like up there.
Well, hi, Dan. First of all, I'm a commercial instrument-rated private pilot and flew for about 3 years from Washington to the Morristown, Essex County Airport area, and have flown several times in the last few months to Martha's Vineyard. And at about that time of night, it would have been dark. There would have been certainly within the regulatory, rules, not required to file a VFR flight plan. Unfortunately, that probably was not something that I would recommend to anyone. It's certainly hard to believe, given the fact that there was a flight instructor on board. I understand from listening to another station that John F. Kennedy had an injury to a foot that had him in a cast, and that may have impaired his ability to maneuver the rudder pedals in a situation where there was a loss of control of the airplane.
Kevin, excuse me for interrupting.
Sure.
First of all, we do not know as a fact, we here at CBS News do not know as a fact, that John F. Kennedy's foot was impaired in that way. Yes, there's been a lot of talk about it, and it's believed that was the case. I just want to emphasize, but, and forgive me if you must for interrupting your flow,
Sure.
But if it were true that John F. Kennedy had that sort of impediment to one foot, would a qualified flight instructor have let him be at the controls of this aircraft?
I could only presume that the instructor could have come to a conclusion that the injury would not have impaired his ability to operate the controls. And so on the positive side, it's hard for me to believe that there was, even in a haze environment, a loss of control of the aircraft. Even private pilots, as part of their licensing and testing procedure, are required to navigate the airplane and maintain it upright relative to the horizon on instruments only. And the combination of two people in the front seat just increases the probability, and the possibility that loss of control was not an issue. On the other hand, that aircraft was probably flying somewhere between 5,500 and 9,500 feet above sea level, and has sufficient gliding range, even if it were in the middle of the sound, to reach the beach on either shore. So on the positive side, there's a possibility that airplane came down in a marshy or even shallow water area and subsequently sunk, which would have explained why the ELT malfunctioned.
The ELT being what, Kevin?
The beacon.
Right.
The emergency locator beacon.
Well, you raise an interesting point here, Kevin, and if it needs to be acknowledged, we acknowledge it. We're looking for any small raft of hope to which to cling in the absence of fact. So you've said something important to me, that let's say they're up, they're in haze, something goes wrong with the aircraft, we believe there was an experienced flight instructor on board, he would have been looking for a beachy area or some marshy area to take the plane to glide it in if necessary. That's what he'd been looking to reach.
Right. Well, first of all, their flight path would have taken them north around New York City and hugging the Connecticut shoreline out as far as Bridgeport. And then they would have had either the choice of staying along the coast as far as Groton or transiting the bay from, or the sound from Bridgeport to the point, I guess Orient Point, which is out there near Plum Island on the way to go directly to Martha's Vineyard. Even if they were over the water, the total distance from either across the sound or out to Orient Point is 25 nautical miles. And at assuming that they weren't at a very low altitude, and anyone flying over water using common sense would typically fly as high as possible, especially since they weren't under the control of ATC, since they were flying under visual flight rules, would have chosen, I think, logically to fly at an altitude of 8,000, 9,000 feet, giving them plenty of gliding opportunities to get to at least within swimming distance of the beach. It's hard to believe that anyone would take the unreasonable risk to fly down the middle of the bay at low altitude, at night, without an IFR flight or VFR flight plan even, doing that trip. That's just inconceivable to me.
Kevin, if you don't mind holding on, we want to go to Martha's Vineyard, but I'd like to come back and talk to you. All very interesting, and those of you who have just tuned in. John F. Kennedy Jr. plane is missing, believed aboard a flight instructor, his wife's sister, although that has not been absolutely confirmed. And as the plane has been missing since sometime before midnight last night on this flight from New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard, and concern grows about what's happened to it. And Kevin, helping us out here as a pilot, has raised several possibilities of what could have happened. I italicized the word could have happened, pointing out that at their altitude, 5,500 feet or above, and this aircraft does have glide capability, possibility that they were able to put down in some beachy area, some marshy area, maybe haven't gotten out of there yet, and that's a reason that nobody's heard from them. He just raises that as a possibility, capital P. Here at CBS News, we subscribe to the idea that every man and woman is a reporter, whatever their job may be. Doug Glazier, who is basically a cameraman but also a very good reporter working for CBS on Martha's Vineyard today. And we understand the Kennedy family has had one member holding a sort of impromptu news conference. Doug, if you're there, what can you tell us about it?
Yes, hi, Dan. I'm standing here actually outside the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, where Brian O'Connor, a Kennedy spokesman, just held a press conference. What he did confirm was that on board the plane was John Kennedy, Carolyn, and their sister-in-law. No flight instructor or any other people around the plane.
Excuse me, Doug, that Carolyn being his wife.
Correct.
Right.
And because we weren't sure if John had what type of a license to fly, that he could not confirm that, but assumed that John was the only one who was licensed to fly, so that the assumption is that he was at the controls of the plane. They said that the members of the Kennedy family are right now at a mass, and that essentially they're praying for members of the family who aren't here at the compound for this wedding.
Doug, what's the mood there?
It's tense. There's a big media horde, and of course the lots of police and officials. The Kennedys are staying out of sight, and there's a lot of curious onlookers, but it is a very sort of a tense mood. I think people are feeling very bad about what possibly could have happened. but I think a lot of folks certainly are trying to stay optimistic.
Let's note that there are various reports now, none of them, as far as we can determine, absolutely and positively confirmed, that a light aircraft believed, score that word if you will, believed to have been the plane of John F. Kennedy Jr., that Piper Saratoga single engine, not a jet, single regular engine aircraft, may have been seen on radar at approximately 9:39 p.m. last night approaching Martha's Vineyard. Now this would square with other reports that indicated that the aircraft might have, again please score the word, might have been just west of Martha's Vineyard, trying to make an approach in hazy conditions. We don't know with precision how deep the haze was, but there have been various reports from other pilots that the haze was pretty thick and getting thicker as the night went along. Now, WBZ Radio in Boston, CBS affiliate there, is reporting that the plane was believed last seen on radar. That's another report. We've had these reports during the morning. We're being super careful about what we know to be a fact. We don't know it to be a fact. But given that the plane took off from New Jersey, this small Piper Saratoga, about 8:45, it's reasonable to believe that if it didn't have any difficulty on the way, it could have been on the way. It could have been in the area of Martha's Vineyard about 9:39. So somebody somewhere at least believes they've seen something on a radar screen indicating that the plane might have been west of Martha's Vineyard. Pretty thin stuff and not confirmed, but as we try to accumulate information, you may want to make note of that. If you're saying to yourself, well, what about the reports earlier that there was a beeper signal off Long Island? Yes, there were some unconfirmed reports of a possible beeper signal off the upper end of Long Island, that is the part of the island pointed toward Martha's Vineyard, if you will. And the Coast Guard checked that out. We haven't heard from the Coast Guard, but the last reports were, well, whomever heard that or thought they heard that beeper, it was only heard one time. It may or may not be connected with the missing aircraft of John F. Kennedy Jr. Anthony Mason has joined me here on the set at our CBS News World headquarters in New York. We were talking about what little we know about the flight, various reports, but let's back off for what we call on television the wide shot. Who John F. Kennedy Jr. was, what he was like. Russ Mitchell is preparing some information. We're going to go to him shortly. But Anthony, I can't, you can't do this reporting and not recognize that he was, in many people's mind, he's forever burned into what I call the Museum of Our Memories as that brave little boy in the blue coat and the shorts who saluted his father's casket.
The salute. It's a photograph I don't think anybody ever forgets. I think even if you look at it now, you would be touched by it. It's an incredibly touching photograph. And one of the things that distinguishes John F. Kennedy, aside from the fact that he has the Kennedy name, and we've talked about this morning, the fact that Michael Kennedy, even when he died 2 years ago, someone most Americans really didn't know very much about, drew a lot of national attention. In John F. Kennedy Jr.'s case, he really is somebody many people feel they knew from the time he was a little boy. We've grown up with him, and we saw how he endured what was a national, in fact, an international tragedy. And so I think that makes this occasion particularly concerning to everybody.
Concerning at the very least. We're going to go to Maggie Cooper, who's on Long Island and is covering the Coast Guard search. Maggie?
Hi, Dan. Yes, we're at the Mattituck Inlet Marina and Shipyard, and it's very eerie because just like TWA 800, 3 years ago today, flotillas of small and large boats are heading out on Long Island Sound from marinas up and down the area here. So it's very eerily reminiscent of 3 years ago today. Now, we talked to a Coast Guard Petty Officer Vossler from the New London, Connecticut Coast Guard Station. He is a reserve officer. And all that he was really able to tell us is that they will be working a mathematical grid, a search pattern that's based on a mathematical grid. And when asked what they'll be looking for, he said they'll be looking for debris. Anything that common sense would tell them is the sign of a crash. And as you might guess, that's pretty much all he was able to give us for the time being. He's a reserve member and is in his everyday job as a Stamford Police Department officer. So there have been, this is a relief crew. There's already been a Coast Guard crew out this morning, since early this morning. They came in. These guys are the relief crew. They just came in to refuel, and they'll be headed back out. And they're on a 41-foot utility Coast Guard boat as well. So, as he said, they'll be looking for pretty much for signs of a crash. And we're also going to be on our way out. We've found ourselves a boat, and we'll be going out to see what we can find out from the possible scene.
Thank you
Dan?
very much, Maggie Cooper, on Long Island as the search for John F. Kennedy Jr.'s missing aircraft continues and intensifies at this hour. Now, having said before, we consider every CBS News employee a reporter. That CBS News can now report we have confirmed that John F. Kennedy Jr. was seen early last evening working out in a Manhattan gymnasium, and that's important because a CBS News person saw a replacement cast on his leg. I underscore the word a replacement cast. Now, this is the type of cast put on after a main cast is taken off. Why is this important? Because we've emphasized during the morning that we didn't know for a fact whether John F. Kennedy had some impediment at his lower extremities. There had been these reports, well, yeah, he'd broken something in his leg or his leg had trouble. Now we know that he had on a replacement cast on his leg before he took off last night. That's the type of cast that goes after the main cast. Now we're going to go back to Kevin Smedley, our pilot, we're going to say expert pilot, on flying this kind of aircraft and on this kind of flight going from roughly New Jersey into Martha's Vineyard. Kevin, if you're still there, now we can say, well, okay, he had this replacement cast on his leg. So now back to the question. He has the flight instructor with him in the aircraft. The flight instructor, would it be normal for a flight instructor under those circumstances to say, well, it's okay if he flies the aircraft?
I would think that the way the regulations are worded is you have to make your own, the pilot in command has to make his own decision about whether he's free of impediments that would affect the safe outcome of his flight. I think the flight instructor had the responsibility, since he was acting as the second in command, to make his own determination for his own safety and for the safety of the other passengers, and in his role as a flight instructor to make a decision about whether John Kennedy was also capable of operating that aircraft safely. So at least two people came to independent decisions that whatever impediments he had, they did not reasonably affect his operational capability of that aircraft.
Kevin, thank you very much. I hope you stay with us here, at least stand by available, because there's this information on what it's like to fly in these conditions, that there was haze, and haze in its own way, its own unique way, can be very dangerous for this small an aircraft. Although we come back to, there was a flight instructor there with John F. Kennedy, and John F. Kennedy Jr. was not a very experienced pilot, but he had gotten at least a permit by going to school in Florida. He was receiving additional training, as evidenced by the fact that the flight instructor is believed to have been with him on this flight last night. Tragedy just seems to follow this Kennedy family. As we've talked along here, we've mentioned it before, that the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the president, the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy when he was running for president in 1968, the difficulties Senator Ted Kennedy, who wanted to run for president and then later tried in 1980, actually, during the primary season at the convention. In the early 70s, car ran off this bridge in Chappaquiddick, killing a young woman, and all that flowed out of that. Just one thing after another. But Anthony, noting here that while tragedy seems to follow this family, it particularly seems to follow this young woman, Rory.
Yeah. You know, you're talking about the setting, Dan, is what strikes me most of all today is you're imagining the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, which is an image many of us are familiar with, that series of white houses by the sea. They have a white tent set up there. There was going to be a wedding tonight. I mean, they were ready for an extraordinary celebration for Rory. And but she is the same woman who, Ethel Kennedy was pregnant with Rory when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. It was Rory who held Michael when he was dying on the ski slope. Now she's got another tragedy she has to deal with.
CBS News correspondent Mike Wallace and 60 Minutes editor is on Martha's Vineyard. Mike?
Hey, Dan. Everybody's in a kind of shock here in the Vineyard. It's hard to come to terms with it, very few people, when I first got up this morning and heard about it, I was on my way to play tennis and heard it on the radio, listened to you guys, and it is simply a stunning, stunning event. It's hard to make sense of the darn thing. I went out to the airport just within the last hour to pick up Chris Wallace and his family, who are here for a week. And at the airport, you would not know that anything had happened. There's no crowd there. There's just people getting on and off planes. It has done nothing to airplane traffic at the Martha's Vineyard Airport. And when you talk to people, they don't believe it. A lot of them haven't heard about it yet and haven't seen any television coverage. He loved the Vineyard. After his mother passed, there was some talk about the fact that he was going to perhaps sell that beautiful house that she had, but he decided, I guess, to keep it, and so he's spent time here this summer over and over. Whether he's flown out, I have no idea. But good Lord, what in the... It is difficult to figure how this could happen to this family yet again.
Mike, going back, President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963.
Yep.
Senator Robert F. Kennedy in 1968. You were covering Richard Nixon during that period. It was the period when Robert Kennedy. Did you ever talk to the late President Richard Nixon about the Kennedys, the Kennedy family?
Oh, he had
didn't mean to the country?
Yes, I did. He had great admiration. I was surprised. Richard Nixon had great admiration for John Kennedy. He knew that he had met his match, and you know, there was some talk about what had taken place in Illinois and with the votes out of Illinois at the time of the election, and Richard Nixon decided not to contest or make anything difficult back in 1960. He had nothing unpleasant ever to say about Jack Kennedy or about any of the Kennedys. I had dinner the other night with Ted Kennedy up here in the Vineyard. He comes in and out, and he was looking forward to what's happening this weekend, and he's full of beans about the Patient's Bill of Rights, and he was looking forward to going back to Washington for what happened this. I mean, it is hard to come to terms with it, Dan.
Mike, in your role as a 60 Minutes co-editor, you circulated around, talked to a lot of people. Was the presumption alive and working that John F. Kennedy some way, somehow, was going to eventually run for public office? We've discussed it here this morning, and I know from talking to him personally, briefly once, that he just, put all those kind of questions aside. But let's talk about that for a moment. Certainly, if he chose to run, he'd be a formidable candidate.
Indeed, he would. I got the feeling that he was not particularly interested in it. From what little we never talked about it at any length. I would see him from time to time here in the Vineyard. We weren't close friends by any means. But I never got the feeling that he was ready for that yet. I think that he was really quite content running the magazine and living the life that he was living. And he was fascinated with the news. I understand, I didn't see her, but I understand that Christiane Amanpour and her husband, Jamie Rubin of State Department, Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, were up there visiting him last week. The one reaction, of course, that you have heard from a few people who know that this has taken place here, is that it was 30 years ago this weekend that the Chappaquiddick thing took place. But
Mike, we appreciate you being with us. If you have a
if there's
chance
anything I'll try to find out more, but I think most of what is going on apparently is going on 10, 15 miles west of the Vineyard, and they're looking and hoping that maybe there's a raft or a beacon or something, but that's a long, long time. Just one other thing, and get out of your way. There was a private pilot who just come up from New York, knew him, said that he was very familiar with, Kennedy, was familiar with the plane, and that the plane itself, apparently, he said, was a first-rate aircraft. So,
Mike Wallace,
right
on Martha's Vineyard. We'll be back in touch. For those of you just now joining us and haven't heard the news or have heard just snatches of the news, at CBS News World Headquarters, this is what we know and what we don't know. A search, a widespread and widening search, is underway for a small plane, a Piper Saratoga, was carrying John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife Carolyn Bessette, and her sister. It's now been pretty much confirmed that they were aboard, along with a flight instructor. The Piper Saratoga, piloted possibly by Kennedy himself, although no one can say who was at the controls of the plane. The aircraft disappeared last night on a flight from New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. The flight took place in overall clear weather, but there was a lot of haze, and various reports have said it was sort of deepening, thickening haze, which can be dangerous, especially for small aircraft such as this. The Coast Guard and the U.S. Air Force, the Air National Guard, are searching waters between eastern Long Island and Martha's Vineyard for any sign of the aircraft. John F. Kennedy Jr., many call the, quote, the heir to Camelot, the son of the slain President John F. Kennedy, was on his way to the wedding of his cousin, Rory. Now, she's the daughter of Ethel Kennedy and the late Senator Robert F. Kennedy. That wedding, scheduled for early this evening, has now been canceled as the family awaits word. And let me pause and say here that I know from past experience with these kinds of stories, there's always somebody around who will say to you, well, you know, they know what's happened, but they just are not ready to announce it officially. That is not the case. We're telling you what we know, what we can confirm, and quite frankly, we've gone a little further than some of us are comfortable with in talking about what some of the possibilities are. But nonetheless, this is not a case of something dire has happened and we're just waiting for the official word to be put together and the statement to be put out. That is not the case. And if it needs to be said, I would trust it would not. Keep in mind that CBS News, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, broke the news that the president was not only shot but was dead before the official statement was made, because we knew it to be a fact. At any rate, President Clinton is at Camp David. He's expressed his concern. He's talked to members of the Kennedy family, including Senator Ted Kennedy, who was there for the wedding, of course, and President Clinton is said to be following the progress of the search. Now, Lieutenant Ed Gaynor, the U.S. Coast Guard Cape Cod duty officer, is on hand with an update. Lieutenant, thanks for being with us. What can you tell us?
Yes, good afternoon. Currently, the on-scene weather that the helicopter reported out there is good conditions. The visibility is 10 nautical miles, which helps with the search. The seas are a little bit light chop with 2 to 4 feet, and the winds are roughly 20 knots from the west. No report of any debris or anything. The Falcon, or correction, the jet aircraft is also out there conducting the search as we speak.
Lieutenant, what are the weather conditions at the moment?
I'm sorry, there's a real bad connection. Can you say that again?
What are the weather conditions there at the moment? Is the weather clear?
Yes, the weather's clear. Like I said, 10 nautical miles is the visibility that the helicopter's reporting. Winds are 20 knots out of the west, and just a light chop on the water, 2 to 4 foot with seas.
Thank you very much for being with us, and we'll stay in touch as the search goes along. In our Washington studio now, Drew Stikati, forgive me, Mr. Stikati, Vice President, Airline Pilots Association. You can talk about the beacons, and I hope you'll forgive me if I mispronounced your name, but thank you very much for being with us.
Dan, the name is Steketee, and you got very close to it.
Thank you very much, and I do appreciate you being with us. Let's talk about the beacons. First of all, what do we know about this aircraft, this Piper Saratoga? What do you know about the aircraft? What do you know about the beacon capability in case it went down someplace under dire circumstances?
The Piper PA-32 Saratoga is a 6-seat airplane with dual controls up front. It's not usually flown by 2 pilots, but there are 2 pilot positions up front. The beacons are called emergency locator transmitters, or ELTs. They are required on every non-turbojet airplane in the United States with an electrical system.
This is not a turbojet airplane, not a jet of any description.
No, this has a piston engine, much like the one in your car, but more reliable for aviation use.
Considered a reliable aircraft?
Very much so. It's sort of the top-of-the-line single-engine airplane, except for a much fancier pressurized version in the Piper line. I've flown this aircraft 500 hours, and it is more forgiving, in fact, than a airplane of another manufacturer. It's easy to handle, and the only difference for a pilot moving up from a smaller single-engine airplane is it handles a little differently between being lightly loaded and heavily loaded.
Let's talk about that for a moment, but before we do so, let me pause and point out that the Coast Guard, the United States Coast Guard, and the Air Force have scheduled a briefing for 1 p.m. Eastern Time at the Pentagon on this situation of John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane missing, with his wife's sister, and a flight instructor believed to have been aboard. That would be about 1 hour and 15 minutes from now. There will be a briefing which will concentrate on the search itself. Now, back to discussing the airplane, you mentioned that when one begins on a lighter aircraft, a smaller aircraft than this Piper Saratoga, the indication is that's, in fact, I think it's fair to say that John F. Kennedy, he owned a previous plane which was a smaller plane. Now he steps up to this aircraft. He's only owned this aircraft, we believe, for about 2.5, 3 months maximum, we're told. So if he was at the controls, keeping in mind we don't know that he was at the controls, if he was at the controls and he has this replacement cast on a foot, does that come into play in any way in flying this aircraft?
That would be sort of on the edge of speculation. The airplane is quite a bit bigger than a small training plane, so therefore there would be a little more room for a cast or leg device. It could play a role in egress of the aircraft in a water landing, but I think factors that people will be looking at much more are hazy conditions, whether there was a flight instructor on board, and any possible mechanical failure, but mechanical failure is a very small occurrence in general aviation accidents.
Let's talk about the haze conditions. We've been talking about this through the morning. I pointed out I had a personal experience flying, I'm not a pilot, but flying in a very small aircraft in hazy conditions, and it got, to say the least, hairy in a hurry once. Tell us about the hazy conditions. We don't know in detail. The weather overall was, quote, clear, but other pilots who flew roughly the same route to Martha's Vineyard that John F. Kennedy Jr. was supposed to fly, it pointed out there was haze late yesterday afternoon. It seemed to be getting deeper into the night. How big a factor would that be in making this kind of flight?
Dan, I think there are a number of pilots around the country this morning that were ripping their hair out about earlier comments on haze. Haze in itself will not kill an airplane. However, over-water flights at night are a little tricky, and when haze is involved, it gets much trickier. Oftentimes you have to revert to the procedures used for instrument flight. Private pilots are trained in the basics of that flying, but there are some considerations on a route from New York to Martha's Vineyard in that regard.
Now, forgive our ignorance of aircraft if you must. Would this plane, this Piper Saratoga, have at least rudimentary instrument capability?
Yeah, we've come a long way from the Piper Cub days. Airplanes like this, in fact most airplanes in the fleet, have all the basic instruments of an airliner. They may be miniaturized, they have all the electronic communications and navigations equipment, and most of them have satellite navigation today. They're very well equipped.
We're talking to the Vice President of the Airline Pilots Association, Drew Stickerty, and again I appreciate you giving us your time and also indulging us with what have to be, for a pilot of your capabilities, dumb questions. But let's back off and ask this question. In your mind, what are the principal questions at the moment, knowing as little as we know about this flight? What are you saying to yourself, well, these are the main questions I'm asking myself?
If I can correct you, it's the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. We represent everybody in non-airline aviation. And I think pilots today will be very concerned about JFK Jr. as a person and his family. It was big news when he started flight training and became a pilot. Some issues that happen in these areas are loss of spatial orientation in nighttime conditions. We have very little moon. The full moon is on the 28th of the month. Combined with flying over water, it gets to be a black hole, and there have been accidents in the past. They'll also be looking at any possible mechanical failure that would cause them to lose power, but that is a very rare occurrence in this day and age. We try to fly near land, so if we do have a mechanical problem, we can glide to land. And on the route to Martha's Vineyard, there is actually an island chain that runs from the tip of Long Island through Fisher's Island, New York, the Connecticut and Rhode Island coast, and then out to Martha's Vineyard, and pilots try to stay on that track.
They try to stay on that track, check me here, because if anything goes wrong, they have the possibility of putting the plane down on an island beach or something near an island, or perhaps on the island itself?
Exactly. The name of the game, although there are temptations to go on a straight line to Martha's Vineyard, the name of the game is really flying a route that will allow you, after an engine failure in a single-engine airplane, to glide to land. And most of the way to Martha's Vineyard, you can do that with the judicious choice of course.
I do want to underscore that you are the Vice President of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, not the Airline Pilots Association. I apologize for that mistake. Obviously, live television, we're going to have some of that. I want to go back to what's going through your mind in terms of questions. You mentioned spatial relations. I'm not quite sure I know what that means. Is this a case of if a pilot, perhaps even a pretty good pilot, gets in deep fog or particularly in haze, it's akin to what scuba divers go through, sort of you lose a relationship of where you are, and the plane could even turn upside down or something in the confusion?
It's called spatial disorientation, and it's more of a risk at nighttime than during the day. You can lose track of which way is up. Most time this is not a problem because you have a full array of instruments. You have an artificial horizon on the control panel. You just revert to using the artificial horizon when there's no good natural horizon outside the plane. It does happen sometimes over water at night where a pilot will lose track of which way is up. Usually this happens on takeoff when you leave the land and fly over the coast and enter into an overwater flight. At cruise altitude, where we can assume he was at this time, that would be less of a problem. However, out in that part of New England, there are places with very few ground lights, and sometimes it can be a factor.
They would have been flying at a minimum altitude if they routine fly at what, maybe 5,000 feet or above?
Again, having flown this trip about 100 times, and in that kind of airplane, I suspect he may have been up around 7,000 feet. Could be as low as 5, could be as high as 9,000.
Now let's talk about the locator beacon. As you know, there was an unconfirmed report earlier in the morning, and I italicize unconfirmed report. We don't have two independent sources on this, that there was a beep that somebody somewhere thought might be a locator beacon, and the Coast Guard's checking it out. Put that in perspective, in context for us.
Unfortunately, the emergency locator transmitter beacons go off all the time. They're very susceptible to accidental triggering, and in fact 97% of all alarms are in fact false alarms. It's very unfortunate. If there was a beacon hit there, they will check it out. The beacons are read mostly these days by satellites in space. They are also detected by airplanes flying over on some occasions and can be tracked by the Civil Air Patrol, the Coast Guard, and Air Force Rescue.
Now, this Piper Saratoga would have had an emergency beacon on board.
Yes.
That's required, is it?
Right.
Is it part of the aircraft itself or something contained inside it?
It is attached to the airplane, usually in the tail area, which is the part of the plane that most often survives a crash. It has a long life battery in it and a small independent antenna. It's triggered by the G-forces of a crash. Unfortunately, they can also be triggered by hard landings, and in fact, if they're being tested in a shop or dropped on the ramp, if they're being removed, they can go off.
Please stay with us, but we're now told Doug Glazier, who's our CBS News reporter and basic cameraman on Martha's Vineyard, now has raised the possibility, he's talked to any number of people there, that it may, again, let me italicize the word, may turn out to be the case that no instructor was on board this aircraft. That's the first time that we've really heard that in any substantial way. Certainly in these situations, there's a rumorous second, but that would change the context and perspective of this missing John F. Kennedy light plane in a hurry if no instructor was on board. And if you can, Mr. Stickety, stay with us, I want to go to Bob Orr, who's in our Washington Bureau with additional information. Bob?
Well, Dan, that's a central question and a big question. I just got off the phone with both representatives of the NTSB and the FAA. They have also heard these reports that perhaps the flight instructor was not on board, but it's really just the latest in a series of conflicting reports. It's a real important question, though, because apparently Mr. Kennedy does not have a great number of hours, in this airplane. Flying at night is a little dicey. I mean, you have to understand what he was trying to do, presumably. He's flying a flight path that would pretty much take him along the coast, in sight of land as far as he can. That gives him the opportunity to go to some airports if there was a problem. But at some point west of Martha's Vineyard, he does have to make a right turn and go out over water. If he is alone as a relatively low experienced pilot at night, and if there was a problem, and I will give you that that's three big ifs, we don't know that any of those things are exactly right, that's problematic, Dan, and I think this is one thing that the investigators want to try to pin down. Even the investigators have gotten conflicting information on the very point of whether or not there was a flight instructor on board, and it's one of the first things they're trying to learn.
Bob Orr in our Washington studio. Now let's go back very quickly to the Vice President of the Aircraft Owners and Operators Association. This puts, if true, if there was not a flight instructor on board, and given, while we don't know precisely how much experience John F. Kennedy had as a pilot, we know that by no stretch could he be described as a very experienced pilot. Put that into some perspective for us.
I do not know his pilot record at this point. However, he's been in the game a very few years, possibly as few as 2 years. I think it was probably about 2 years ago he made a very big splash by dashing in and out of the big Oshkosh fly-in in Wisconsin. Made big news that he was beginning to become a pilot. I think he has a private pilot license and by now perhaps several hundred flight hours. That would be a low-time pilot, but low-time pilots can be safe too.
Indeed, particularly if, as every pilot must, they have caution foremost in their mind. I recognize that coverage, and this is not unusual in a circumstance like this, can be confusing because you hear conflicting reports on our air and then people flick around. And so let's pause for a moment. John F. Kennedy Jr.'s aircraft is missing. It's widely believed, and we are now prepared to say it's a fact, that his wife was on board the aircraft and her sister was on board the aircraft. It's widely believed that his wife and her sister, Lauren, were both on the plane. Now, it's no longer clear whether there was a flight instructor aboard the plane or not. For a number of hours, I would say through all of the early hours, there was an assumption being the mother of much foul up in journalism, there was an assumption that it was true that a flight instructor was aboard the plane. Now the question has been raised whether there was in fact a flight instructor on the plane or not. Allegedly, supposedly, and reportedly, at least some members of the family on Martha's Vineyard do not believe that an instructor was necessarily aboard the plane. So that's where we are with that story. Secondly, what about a beacon being heard early in the morning? No confirmation of that whatsoever. Yes, there was a report that one beeper might have been heard, the Coast Guard checking it out, but as we were told by just a moment ago by Drew Stikati, it's not unusual for these kind of beacon signals to go off, and 97% of them turn out to be nothing. But of course, there's always that 3% that it raises the possibility that a beacon may have gone off. But that in itself is not confirmed. There's much more that we don't know than that we do know. What we do know is that it's been many hours now. It's been more than 12 hours since the John F. Kennedy Jr. aircraft was due on Martha's Vineyard. We do know that the plane took off about 8:45 last night. There was an assumption, a widespread assumption, and there's no reason to doubt it, that he was headed for Martha's Vineyard with his wife and her sister on board the plane. The weather conditions included haze, a sort of deepening haze as the evening went along, and as we've discussed, that could be a factor in an aircraft getting into some difficulty. The plane was a Piper Saratoga, single-engine, piston-driven engine aircraft, a step up in planes for John F. Kennedy Jr. He had started owning an aircraft not as big as this one a couple of months ago. He acquired this aircraft and had been flying this aircraft most recently. How experienced a pilot was he? The fact of the matter is we do not know exactly what his experience was, but he did get his original permit about 2 years ago in Florida and had progressed since that time. Now, a widespread search is underway. It's been pointed out several times there are all kinds of possibilities of survival here. including, most recently discussed on our air, that there are a lot of little islands between Long Island and Martha's Vineyard. It's normal for pilots to want to stick fairly close to that sort of line of islands in case anything goes wrong with an aircraft, malfunction or otherwise. Their best possibility would be to get down on a beach or something very near a beach of one of those islands. That's what we know, and a lot of what we don't know up to this moment. Anthony Mason, always in the background, just over our shoulders, we talk about this, is the history of this family having so much difficulty, and who John F. Kennedy Jr. was and what he represented. We've talked about, burned in our memory, the salute as a child as his father's funeral procession went by. There was the death of his mother, the great and legendary First Lady Jackie Kennedy. Then People magazine more recently, as he got out, and particularly when he was single, I think even since, People magazine called him, quote, the sexiest man alive.
Those were the words.
A star by any measurement, deep into celebrityhood, not of his choosing by any measure, and a young man to deal with all of those pressures while growing up. It comes to my mind, somebody said, well, why would he be flying his own airplane? Well, first of all, a lot of people like to fly.
Sure.
I mentioned earlier, I think, just a brief conversation with him, and he talked about being an astronaut. Not that he wanted to be an astronaut, but he clearly had his eye on the sky. Also, as a young man, he once owned a motorcycle. I remember seeing a motorcycle parked outside a place where he had breakfast one morning. He had his motorcycle there. Now, he hadn't been riding his motorcycle, I think, since he'd been married. But that was, you know, he went through a motorcycle stage. None of this uncommon.
No, I think you have to look at even his starting of George magazine was an expression that he was ready to break out on his own and wanted to be judged, you know, as himself and not as the child of his father. And this may be another expression of that, for all we know. It's, as you say, it's not unusual for somebody to fly a plane, but it is unusual when John F. Kennedy Jr. has a problem with one.
As you've been listening to our coverage here as we come up to noon in the East, and for those of you just joining us, we'll have another recap soon on the fact that John F. Kennedy Jr.'s small Piper Saratoga plane is missing. Anthony, as you've listened through here, what questions are running through your mind? What are the most important questions at this hour? One, of course, the major question is what happened.
Well, the big question, it's been the big question from early this morning when we first heard this story, is there's an enormous time gap between when the plane took off at 8:45 in New Jersey and when it was due to arrive. We know that someone was actually waiting for the plane at 9 p.m. on Martha's Vineyard, that they actually expect it would be there that soon. So the big question is the Coast Guard search did not begin until 8 o'clock this morning Eastern Time. So, you know, maybe the family went to bed thinking, you know, maybe he didn't leave, or maybe he put down somewhere else. The wedding was this evening, so he could have waited a little longer to get there. But there's a big time frame there when there was no search going on when that plane was missing. And that's what causes us to have the concern, of course. It's also going to cause some people to ask the questions of why there wasn't, you know, why a search may not have been launched sooner.
It occurs to me when you say, well, perhaps they went down someplace and, you know, on the beach of one of these small islands or put down in a marshy area. People these days generally carry cell phones, and you know, first thing as well, they put down someplace you would have heard from them by this time that they had a cell phone, but not necessarily true.
No, but you got to ask yourself the question, if John F. Kennedy Jr. lands suddenly someplace in the United States, we're probably going to hear about it pretty quickly. And they've also had time this morning to call a lot of the airports and check and see if anything's been going on. That's not to say it couldn't have happened, but the likelihood now, as you mentioned, 12 hours into this, is getting slimmer and slimmer.
Dan Rice is with Channel 2 WCBS News here in New York, chopper pilot, and he's over Long Island Sound. Do you hear us okay, Dan?
I can hear you, Dan.
Well, what do you see there?
Well, at this moment, we're just looking out at the window. We can see a lot of private boats on the island, on the Sound right now. We have a lot of people out here, obviously, trying to search the Sound. But at this point, it's a very hazy picture, and it's just a very scattered area, people trying to find what they can find out here.
Well, the one thing that this view from the WCBS TV Chopper 2 does give us is a sense of the immense size of the area to be searched. Mind you, this is just what the television camera can see. In effect, if you will, like a flashlight beam, you can only see where we point the lens of the camera. But this gives you some idea of what a huge search area this is. And exactly where are you now, Dan?
We are actually over the town of Mattituck on Long Island, and this is the north end of the island, and this is where the Long Island Sound is located, which the sound runs between Long Island and Connecticut up towards Martha's Vineyard.
If we can take that helicopter picture again, perhaps you can see just in the upper right-hand corner that white stuff is beach area, and we talk about, well, if a pilot got in trouble and was looking to get down with his aircraft, this is exactly the kind of beach area. He'd be trying to put that aircraft, as I understand it, down pretty close to the beach where he could swim or wade in, or perhaps right on the beach itself. And there are miles and miles of these long blonde beaches, not just on Long Island, but on these small, tiny islands, many of them uninhabited, or at the very most sparsely inhabited, running all the way from Long Island over to Martha's Vineyard. So when we have someone talking about, well, the pilot, if he got in trouble, might put down in such an area, there are a lot of places where that could have happened. There are also a lot of marshy areas. Yes, Dan?
So you're absolutely right, because I spent many years flying in fixed-wing airplanes doing traffic, and the one thing when we were along the shoreline, we always tried to stay over the beach area because that would be the one place you'd want to put the plane down. And you have to remember, it looks like we have high tide out here, so you're actually not seeing as much of the beach as there actually is.
And then there are those marshy areas, Dan, where, again, if you were looking for a place to put down, the marsh wouldn't be a bad place to which to aim if you were trying to put down.
No, you're absolutely right, because that could act almost as a cushion for the airplane as it comes down, because the water actually can be quite hard depending how fast you hit it.
Dan, we want to get back with you again. It's been very instructive to us, and again I'm reminded of, you know, the sea is great and a small airplane being so small, and the sky great and the aircraft so small. You know, they say that sailors are fond of saying that the sea is unforgiving. Pilots know that the air is even less forgiving. A mistake in the air can cost you dearly, perhaps cost you lethally, if you're not well trained and you don't react correctly. That's not to say that that's what's happened with John F. Kennedy's aircraft. We don't know, but it's just as you're flying up there, Dan, it occurs to me, you see the water, see still some haze. Mind you, the haze was reported to be much worse than that during last evening, but you can see it's kind of a hazy. But you're just reminded of how fragile an aircraft, any aircraft, is in God's great sky, to say nothing of God's great water. We're going to go back to Doug Glazier, our CBS News reporter and cameraman who's working for us today on Martha Vineyards. Doug, if you're still there, I want to get back to this question of whether there was or was not a flight instructor on board the aircraft. What exactly have you heard about that?
Okay, Dan. Well, I'm standing outside the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, and about an hour ago, Brian O'Connor, a Kennedy family spokesman, came out and held a little impromptu press conference. What he did confirm that on board the plane were 3 people, John Kennedy, his wife Carolyn, and their sister-in-law. No flight instructor or no other party was on the plane. Now, he did not confirm whether or not John Kennedy actually had a license or if he was qualified to fly that type of plane, but he assumed that he was the only person on that plane with a license, so therefore he was the de facto pilot.
Well, Doug, this is getting to be important because we may have raced past an important development in this story. I want to be precise now of what the spokesman said. The spokesman confirmed that aboard the plane was John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife, his wife's sister.
That's
that would be for a total of 3 aboard the aircraft. He didn't confirm that anybody else was on the plane.
That's correct, Dan. He said there were 3 people on the plane, and that was it. Other parties on board the plane.
Now, if we report, Doug, in your judgment, I'm asking for your opinion, which is all I can ask for at the moment. We'll make our judgment here. But should or should we not now report that it's unknown whether a flight instructor was aboard the plane, or was that statement given in such a way to lead you and others to believe that the Kennedy family, at the very least, believes there was not a flight instructor on this aircraft?
Well, according to, again, Brian O'Connor, the Kennedy family spokesman, I mean, his information was that there were 3 people on the plane. A lot of the other facts he could not confirm or wouldn't, but he did at least confirm that according to his information, there were just 3 people on that plane.
3 people, period.
Correct.
All right, so in our CBS News continuing coverage, we're going to adjust our coverage now. We believe that there's some confidence in saying that at the very least the Kennedy family believes that it was only John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife, her sister, no flight instructor. Bob Orr, our CBS News aviation expert and correspondent in Washington, is up. Bob?
Well, Dan, it's a key question, a very important one to answer. I can only add this, and it might add to the confusion, but the preliminary report that said there were 4 people on the plane, including a flight instructor, was the information that the FAA was given early this morning. Now, I'm told that the FAA was contacted by members of the Kennedy family. It could be, and it's a real possibility that maybe that's what was believed at that hour, and they've now learned that that wasn't the case. But let me just make this point, and again, we're in the realm of if here. If it was true that John F. Kennedy Jr., a low-hours pilot, a relatively inexperienced pilot, in a relatively new airplane for him, if he was alone at the controls at night, flying over water, trying to hit Martha's Vineyard, that is a very, very risky proposition. And I think just out of caution, it's one that's hard to believe that any relatively inexperienced pilot would attempt. I've talked to a number of experienced pilots this morning, and they have told me they would not want to face that kind of a scenario. So I think just from caution, we have to leave this an open question as to whether or not there was a flight attendant or a flight instructor on board or not. The one other point I want you to know, Dan, is at this hour, the FAA authorities are going to all of the radar installations, and they're trying to contact the air traffic controllers through whose areas this plane may have transversed last night, trying to find out what the radar track of the airplane was. See, this is an important point. Although the plane was on visual flight rules, and although they were flying without a flight plan and they didn't need one, the plane was equipped with a transponder, that electronic beacon that lets the air traffic facilities know where the plane is, depending on its altitude. And what they're going to do, Dan, is try to find out where was the last known reception of that transponder beacon. There have been reports that it was seen just west of Martha's Vineyard just before 10 o'clock, but the FAA says emphatically at this point they cannot confirm that. It's something they're trying to confirm, Dan.
Thank you very much, Bob Orr. Now, one of our best story hunters, Russ Mitchell, has gone out to the West Caldwell, New Jersey airport, and where JFK Jr. took off from last night about 8:45. And on this central point, was there or was there not a flight instructor on board? Because any way you cut it, it changes the whole perspective of this missing John F. Kennedy Jr. plane if a flight instructor was not aboard the plane, as there's a growing bit of testimony indicating that it may not have been a flight instructor. So now we're going to go to Russ Mitchell at the airport from where the plane left. And it's my understanding, Russ, that you talked to someone who saw JFK Jr. before he took off last night.
That is correct, Dan. With me right now is Kyle Bailey. He is a pilot here at the airport. He says he saw John F. Kennedy Jr. last night around 8 o'clock. Kyle, let me ask you, did anything strike you as odd last night about the preparations or the conditions here at the airport?
The weather wasn't the best weather, probably about 4 miles visibility, extremely hazy, reduced visibility. And the one thing I found kind of unusual was that he did his run-up, he ran the engine up on his parking location, not near runway N where it's supposed to be done.
How would you describe the plane that he was in last night?
The airplane, from what I understand, it's a single-engine Piper turbo Saratoga. It's a very extremely high-performance airplane, retractable landing gear, a constant-speed propeller. It's very high-performance and a complex airplane.
And again, as somebody who was here last night and saw John F. Kennedy Jr., you say you saw his wife as well. What was your reaction when you got up this morning and heard about what happened?
Well, this morning I was planning on taking actually the same trip up there to Martha's Vineyard from this airport, and I actually called Flight Service Station where I get my weather from, and they put a notice out for an overdue airplane. And when they said that number, I said, "Oh, don't tell me."
Russ?
That was John Kennedy's airplane.
Russ Mitchell?
And again, as a pilot, you may have touched on this a second ago, but as a pilot, would you have flown in conditions like last night?
Up to the islands, no, I would not have, because in reduced visibility, it's hard to differentiate what's sea and what's air, what's the sky when the visibilities are reduced in haze and fog. And the weather on the islands there, the fog could roll in there in a matter of minutes.
Russ?
Kyle Bailey, a pilot here at Essex County Airport. Thank you very much. Dan, that's a story from here.
Russ Mitchell, before you let that gentleman go, can you ask him the core question of the moment? Did he or did he not see, was he or was he not aware of a flight instructor being aboard this aircraft? Was the plan to have a flight instructor aboard? Did he see a flight instructor with John F. Kennedy Jr.?
Cal, are you aware of a flight instructor being on board with John F. Kennedy? Did you see one last night?
All I saw was John F. Kennedy and his wife getting on the airplane. There could have been an instructor getting on earlier. I did not see one. But then again, my eyes were not on the airplane the whole time. But there could have very well been one on the airplane. But I did not see anybody get on the airplane.
Thanks again, Kyle. Dan, back to you.
Russ, before you let him get away,
yes, sir.
Could he go over again, in his opinion, what the weather was? This becomes increasingly important as nobody has found this missing aircraft for John F. Kennedy Jr. And the official weather was, if you turned on your television set, the conditions are clear. Could he tell us more about what the conditions were exactly when John F. Kennedy Jr. took off? And as a pilot experienced in flying this corridor over to Martha's Vineyard, what kind of conditions John F. Kennedy Jr. would be taking off into?
Cal, can you tell us once again, describing the conditions here at the airport and what the conditions might have been at Martha's Vineyard?
All I could say is the conditions at the airport, that the visibility was a problem, probably 4 or 5 miles visibility, very hazy, and I believe the sky conditions was clear, but the haze and the reduced visibility would have been a problem when you fly over water. And especially up there, I'm not familiar with what the conditions were last night, but I do know that the fog tends to roll in on those islands very quickly this time of year after dark.
And how difficult is it to land under those circumstances?
How difficult?
It's not a matter of landing, it's a matter of being able to see the airport, see the horizon, to be able to figure out the airplane's attitude, its flight path, how is it in reference to the horizon, if you're in level flight or if you're in a turn or a climb or a descent.
Russ Mitchell, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Anthony Mason, again, we don't know what the facts are, but the testimony suddenly now begins to accumulate that a flight instructor may not have been aboard this aircraft. Family members don't believe there was an instructor on board. The official spokesman for the family says that there was John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife, and a sister, period, on board. Now, Russ Mitchell, with a man at the New Jersey airport who saw John F. Kennedy, this witness eyeball says John F. Kennedy, 2 other people got in the plane. He doesn't rule out the possibility that an instructor could have gotten on earlier, but he didn't see any instructor. It's beginning to sound very much as though an instructor may not have been aboard this plane.
It sounds that way. I think, as you've mentioned all along, we have to be very careful, because when we started out this morning, we originally thought that his wife was aboard the plane. Then we heard she wasn't. Then we heard rumors that, again, she was. And now, of course, we have it confirmed from the family that she was. We don't know where these initial reports really came from, other than, as Bob Orr told us, the FAA said that's what they heard. So, I'm still really nervous about all of these details, but as Bob again has pointed out, if the flight instructor was not on the plane, that's very significant. That means he had no help out there if he was in trouble.
Indeed. This is CBS News continuing coverage of the disappearance of John F. Kennedy Jr. In his aircraft. If you're just joining us, a massive search is underway in the waters between eastern Long Island and Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. It's a search for a small aircraft, a Piper Saratoga, single-engine, piston-driven engine aircraft, which was carrying John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife, Carolyn Bassett Kennedy, and her sister, Lauren. We believe, we can say with confidence, that they were aboard the plane. Whether anybody else was aboard the plane, a flight instructor, as was previously reported, question mark, we don't know. However, we've said in the last few moments, there's beginning to be some doubt, considerable doubt, whether there was in fact a flight instructor aboard the plane. The small aircraft disappeared last night en route from New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard. Overall weather conditions clear, but there was considerable haze. Young Kennedy was heading to the wedding of his cousin Rory, the daughter of the slain United States Senator Robert F. Kennedy. The wedding was to be in Hyannisport on Cape Cod. The wedding scheduled for early this evening now has been canceled. Members of the family attended a Roman Catholic Mass this morning to pray for the safety of those on board the plane. President Clinton, who is at Camp David, is said to be monitoring events carefully. He was informed this morning about 7 o'clock that John F. Kennedy Jr.'s aircraft was missing. And the tragedies of the Kennedy family very much in everyone's mind, not only the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and then the assassination in 1968 of his brother Robert F. Kennedy, and the terrible automobile accident which included the death of a young woman in Chappaquiddick in the early 1970s involving Senator Ted Kennedy. on and on it goes. It even goes further back, the so-called, quote, curse of the Kennedy family, the family having lost a son, a brother, older brother of John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, who was a pilot during World War II. That, let me pause for a moment and say that it may be time to remind ourselves that things can look very dark, and you can begin to say, well, it must be one way. And certainly with this aircraft missing for over 12 hours now, it doesn't look good. But we know, life teaches, that sometimes what we expect, what we begin to fear, turns out to be not the case. And so there is still, it's a smaller raft of hope than it was earlier in the morning, but there is still a wee small raft of hope out there to which to cling. We go to Bob Orr in Washington with later information. Bob?
Dan, yes, we have information now from CBS News correspondent John Roberts, who I just had a conversation with. John has confirmed, repeat, confirmed through the West Tisbury police that the Kennedy plane at some point early last night, contacted the Bridgeport Flight Services. And the police are checking out a further report that the Kennedy plane was on the final approach through the Cape approach when it disappeared. Now, this is the most up-to-date information we have as to where the plane was when perhaps it was lost. But the West Tisbury police are clear, saying that the Kennedy plane contacted Bridgeport Flight Services. What that means in layman's terms is that the plane apparently was very close to Martha's Vineyard and was apparently in the process of beginning what would have been a final approach when something apparently went wrong. So this is breaking information that tells us that this search area, at least, very quickly could be narrowed. Now, the FAA, to this point, has not confirmed this, but the FAA earlier said it was going through radar tracking of the airplane, trying to find out where it was last seen on FAA control radar. And I was told about an hour ago that they were checking all the way up the East Coast. There was a report that it was seen west of Martha's Vineyard, but as far as I know, the people reviewing the aircraft radar control tapes have not yet been able to verify that. Well, this is new information, Dan.
Now, Bob, at what time was this radio contact with the Bridgeport, Connecticut airport? At what time is that allegedly, reportedly, and supposedly to have taken place?
We don't know is the right answer, Dan. We do know that the plane took off from West Caldwell, New Jersey between 8:30 and 8:45. I'm told by a number of pilots that this flight, if it's routine, is a little over an hour. So using the clock and going backwards, we could presume, but I emphasize presume, that this contact with the Bridgeport control might have been in the area of 9:30, 9:45, but I do not have that firm. The importance of this, though, is that the Coast Guard search and the Air Force search can be narrowed, and it also now tells us that the plane did have some contact with air traffic services before it was lost, and until now, that was very unclear.
We go to CBS News correspondent John Roberts, who's on the phone from Martha's Vineyard. John?
Dan, we can just add a little bit to that. We just talked with the chief of police of the West Tisbury Police Department, who says that while they did contact a private organization which was tracking them up the coast, apparently it wasn't the Bridgeport FSS. The information that I gave to Bob Orr on that was just a little bit off, but they were tracked. Last time that they were tracked was at 9:38. There have been reports that there was an emergency locator transmitter signal that was picked up about that time in about the area that they would have been in. But in that area is Mattituck Airport, according to the authorities here, which is a center where planes go for maintenance. And it's quite possible that somebody maintaining a plane turned on that transmitter briefly, then turned it back off again just to test it. There's no way with an ELT of tracking exactly which plane it was from. It sends out a very broad signal, which is then picked up. They have said here, though, that contrary to some reports that were going out earlier, there was no contact with the Martha's Vineyard Tower, no contact whatsoever. The last contact, again, was with that private organization which tracks small planes coming up the East Coast, somewhere in the Bridgeport, Connecticut area. Dan?
Thanks, John Roberts on Martha's Vineyard. Back to Bob Orr in Washington now. Bob, John Roberts, continuing to work on the story, says, well, it's his information now that it wasn't a Bridgeport Airport Authority as such that reports having radio contact with the plane, that it was some, quote, private contact. What can you tell us about that?
I cannot clear up the confusion, Dan. I don't know, except that there are a number of small airports, small, uncontrolled private strips. There are people who have access to the radios. This plane, the Kennedy plane, if it's flying visual flight rules and without a flight plan, could be listening to, in aviation parlance, what's known as a common frequency. And on that common frequency, you can have communication between planes with fixed points on the ground, fixed base operators that run general aviation services. The significance, though, should not be lost, Dan, even if John now's telling us it's not the Bridgeport Flight Services, but a private facility near there, it's still an important point that there was contact with the airplane fairly close to Martha's Vineyard, and that's something we didn't know before.
Important for several reasons. Number one, that if true, we believe it to be true, we do not yet absolutely know it to be true, but if true, this will allow the Coast Guard, the Air National Guard, and the Air Force to narrow the search area for the airplane considerably. Secondly, if true, that it indicates that the plane may have been on approach to Martha's Vineyard. A picture is beginning to form. It's vague. From a repertorial standpoint, it's speaking of haze. It's hazy, it's vague, you can barely make it out, but an outline is beginning to form. John F. Kennedy takes off with his wife and her sister. He may not have had a flight instructor aboard. We now have to actively entertain the possibility that a flight instructor was not aboard. Members of the Kennedy family don't think a flight instructor was aboard. He flies into a hazy situation, which can be dangerous. There is one report, unconfirmed, but WBZ Radio in Boston, I think it was the first to report it, that somebody in some place in authority saw what they believed to be a radar hit, if you will, a speck, that they thought was the Kennedy plane about 9:30, 9:35. That goes into what we call raw information. Then we have this information that, well, somebody, a private facility, and Bob Orr has described what that could be, says that they heard on the radio the John F. Kennedy plane beginning to at least be in the area to make an approach to Martha's Vineyard, and that would have been about the time the radar thing was. So you have this sort of outline of what could have, might have happened. But now we come back to what we don't know. We don't know any of that to be a fact. The central headline remains as it has been since sometime after midnight early this morning. The small plane, that Piper plane, single engine of John F. Kennedy Jr. Is missing and unaccounted for. Anthony Mason.
Dan, this information is interesting because it fits. I mean, if everything that we've been hearing this morning is correct, if the plane took off at 8:30, there was, we know, a friend waiting at the Martha's Vineyard Airport at 9 o'clock to pick them up. So maybe they were half an hour behind schedule. They were close at 9:35, possibly. All of this fits. I mean, as we've said, it's an hour flight. Bob Orr said it should be about an hour. They take off at 8:30. They're running half an hour late. A friend was there, gets frustrated, leaves. But it looks like maybe they were close. It all fits into the pattern here.
Let's go to Drew Stickety, who's Vice President of the Aircraft Pilots and Owners Association. Mr. Stickety, you've been listening to all this. What are the significant questions in your mind at the moment, and what about this new information of that somebody now reports having heard from the Kennedy plane as it was at or near the Martha's Vineyard Airport?
Well, many people listen to the aeronautical frequencies on scanners, so that's a possibility. The one that was unusual for me was the report of a private company following the radar track. The radar tracks of aircraft are now available on the internet, which is a very recent and controversial development. However, they're only tagged with the airplane's identification number if they're on a flight plan. So I don't know if someone's speculating here. That one I don't understand. The FAA also has the ability to play back the tape recordings of their radar output, and no doubt they're doing that right now.
And the number one question in your mind in trying to solve this puzzle at the moment is what?
Well, I think I wonder where he is, and I wonder how close the FAA is in their radar tape playback to tracking what was probably a VFR target without an identifier attached to it, and to find out where that little blip falls off the screen.
Now, what would put us in the cockpit of the plane? Small, single-engine, piston-driven aircraft approaching the Martha's Vineyard airport facility in haze. How deep the haze was, we do not know. We haven't absolutely determined, but fairly thick haze and deepening haze. Put us in the cockpit of that plane.
One factor is whether he went on the straight course route over Block Island, direct to Martha's Vineyard, or whether he detoured to the left towards Newport, Rhode Island to stay closer to the coast and then fly over the Elizabeth Islands and Nassau Island, which is a little safer way to do it. If he was out in the middle of the water, he might have had less ground reference and the haze to work with. If he had a mechanical problem going on the straight line route, it would be very difficult to reach land when he had a problem.
Hope you stick with us, Miss, because you're very valuable to us at this moment. Russ Mitchell, who's been reporting from the New Jersey airport from where the plane took off and provided some valuable information with an eyewitness there who said, this eyewitness said that he saw only John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife, and another person. He only saw 3 people actually get aboard the aircraft, and that fits with the later information, that is earlier information, that the family believed that only John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife, and his wife's sister were aboard the plane, no flight instructor, because they said those 3 people, period, were aboard the aircraft. We're continuing to work that part of the story, but earlier Russ Mitchell had prepared a profile on who John F. Kennedy Jr. was. Yes, we've all been familiar with him since he was a child. We all grew up with him. But let's pause for a moment to have Russ report on who this, in many ways, remarkable young man is. Well, we don't have it quite ready yet, and when we get it ready, we'll have it for you. But Anthony, you and I can talk about it. We have earlier on, but you know, after the salute to his father at what age, 6 or 7?
I think it might have even been younger than that, but I'm not sure.
Nonetheless, he was younger than that, as a matter of fact. Definitely was younger than that, but nonetheless, the picture of the salute.
Mm-hmm.
Then he grows up. He goes to school at Brown. He goes to law school. He gets his law degree. He becomes an international sex symbol, and he does become the heir to Camelot.
What was interesting, Dan, to me about John F. Kennedy Jr. was that for a while there he almost seemed to kind of get lost. I mean, yes, he was sort of a sex symbol, but he had brothers and cousins who were running for Congress, who had ambitions in politics, and who were starting to take the stage that his father and his uncles had, and he literally resisted that for a while. A lot of that had to do with his mother, who didn't want him out there, who didn't want the same thing to happen to him that had happened to her husband. But in the last few years, we've seen him start to grab the mantle of the family. And even though he had cousins